Everybody? Yeah, I have no idea whether that microphone's working or not, but anyway, I'll speak into it and hope it does. It's very nice to see you all. I wasn't able to be here this morning, but I heard very good things about lively debates, so we've got a high standard to keep up, and we've also got the after lunch slot, and I don't know about you, but I just had a very large piece of cake, and I try not to be in a sugar coma for the rest of the afternoon. Anyway, it's great to see everybody, and we have a distinguished and illustrious panel for you this afternoon, and essentially this is your opportunity to quiz the funders about how they make those decisions behind closed doors, what their criteria are, what their priorities are, how they balance short-term and long-term considerations. I know you started talking about that this morning. So please don't hold back. It is your opportunity to ask this panel the questions you would like to know the answer to. And when there are questions online, I understand someone will tell us what those are, because we can't see them, I don't think. But hopefully we'll be alerted to those so we can add those into the mix. So I'm not going to do a long introduction of everyone, because I have been on those conference sessions where, you find out what the list of people's GCSEs and what have you, and we probably don't need that. So I'm going to do a very brief introduction and ask people really to introduce themselves. And the way this works is that the people on the panel have just over 5 minutes to talk about the issues that we've just set out there. And then after they've spoken, we can have questions of kind of clarification, anything that didn't make sense. And once we've got through the whole lot, then we'll have a general discussion and try and get to the nub of some of these tricky issues. So it's very much your time. Do please use it. Feel free to be irreverent and ask whatever question you would like to answer, because that's what we're here for. But I'm going to start off by inviting the two people to my right. So Emily and Caitlin from AG Advisors, and I will let you introduce yourselves.
Thank you so much. So, hi everyone, my name's Emily Collins-Ellis. I got 6 A's at GCSE, if you're interested. But no A stars, so there you go. And yeah, we're from IG Advisors. And my colleague Caitlin and I are very lucky to be here in this room and also on this panel. In fact, we've kind of been shoehorned in because we're not actually funders at all. We're philanthropy advisors. So we work with donors and foundations on their giving strategies, and we also work with nonprofits on their strategies for impact. And we're glad to be here because as philanthropy and nonprofit advisors, we are often called to operate within the flawed economic system. We don't always get given space to question it or challenge it, but new economy work is a big passion area of ours, and recently we've been lucky enough to be invited to do some research work into the philanthropic funding of the new economy movement. So we've been doing that for the last year, and our question was, what does this look like, and what can we do to improve it? We're coming at this from a very bird's eye perspective, and so we've kind of got 3 main takeaways for you all today, our kind of advice to you before we move on to hearing from the funders themselves. So the first thing is that any movement for change, any successful movement for change, has to be led by funders and civil society in partnership. Can't be one without the other. Secondly, that the funding landscape itself only responds to issues that feel accessible, hopeful, and relevant. And finally, that to succeed at all, we all need to liberate ourselves from the old economy ways of fundraising and funding. So firstly, I want you to just picture in your mind something that has gone from being a fringe issue with little public support and no philanthropic funding to being a mainstream conversation with the backing of big philanthropic players in our lifetime. So just kind of picture that in your head. So I can imagine for most of you what's coming up is climate change, Black Lives Matter, or maybe even populist right-wing movements like Trump's Make America Great Again. And it's these sorts of examples of fundraising success, and I'm using success around the right-wing populist movements, obviously, that we at IG Advisors have been researching so that we can discern the good, the bad, and the ugly of what successes look like there and what the new economy movement can use from what has worked in those movements. So there's some key things that we found. Firstly, as I said, that any movement for change, any movement that has succeeded, has been led by funders and nonprofits in partnership. We all know that people aren't funding this work enough. The main funders are on this panel or in this room, thank you, by the way. And to get more funders, it's not enough for each of us to become better at fundraising and better engaging with funders for our individual organizations or individual parts of the movement. Movements succeed by crowding in new funding for the issues themselves, and they do that in collaboration with others. So that means organizing together with peer organizations and funders, not working in competition or perpetuating capitalist power dynamics that exist within philanthropy. And the biggest new transformative investments in movements around the world have happened because of funders influencing other funders. And they've been able to do that because of their collaborations with civil society organizations. So the takeaway here on this point is that the people in this room are not your competition. They are key to your success. And it's the people not in this room that we need to be focusing on reaching together. And we need to form alliances and organize towards that goal. So I'm going to pass over to Caitlin, who can share some thoughts about the kind of things that we need to be reaching out with together when we're doing that.
Yeah, hi everyone. So we found, as Emily already said, that the funding landscape responds to issues that are accessible, hopeful, and relevant. So accessibility, firstly. When we talk about accessibility, we're talking about how real and tangible an issue feels for the public. Watershed moments, big shifts in public consciousness make issues more accessible and create prime environments for mobilizing resource. So to give you an example, if you look at the climate space, there have been a series of natural disasters, the release of groundbreaking research, huge events like COP, around which huge amounts of public and media attention and resource have been galvanized. For the UK new economy space, the current economic crisis is also a potential watershed moment, a moment around which to raise awareness of the need for the work and make the cause more accessible to funders. To put it another way, cost of living means a lot more to people than the terms new economy. Secondly, hope. Any fundraiser here today will be aware of the importance of urgency to raise money. Act now, give now. But something really interesting that has come through in the work that we've been doing is the importance of hopeful messaging. Too much doom and gloom can create apathy. The new economy movement needs to create a real, clear, hopeful vision for the future. At IG Advisors, we call this not just communicating what you do, but communicating the so what of your work. And finally, relevance. Economy is a very broad term, so broad as to potentially feel meaningless for some funders. The new economy space needs to communicate how the work intersects with other issues that feel more specific and more relevant. The good news is your work intersects with pretty much anything, be that racial justice, social justice, climate, health. So you've got a lot of possibilities there. And I'm going to pass back to Emily.
Thanks, Caitlin. So I want to leave you with the kind of final and third point, which is around activism. So just quickly, how many of you in the room identify with the term activist? Good, okay, because yes, I would posit that all of us in the new economy movement, regardless of what our job titles are activists in some form. We are influencing and agitating for change, we're changing mindsets, we're bringing bold visions, we're shifting the kind of mental models and cultural norms that we've all kind of grown up with, and all these things are needed for systems change. But when it comes to fundraising, the fundraising part of what we need to survive as our organizations and our movement, we often switch to playing the old economy game. And to be clear, this game is rigged, and our funders are also trapped in that game. It's a game around risk management, scarcity mindset, competition, responsibility to maintain capital and steward it effectively, and appealing to dominant narratives around growth, sustainability, productivity, etc. And I'm sure that many of our fellow panelists would agree that working within funding institutions is no immunity to some of these power dynamics. And often, as grant makers, we're having to agitate for change internally for a really long time before any radical or progressive moves can be made. But as new economy organizers, as activists, we have the knowledge, the skills, and the information to take all funders on a journey in the same way as we work to influence policymakers and other power holders. What would a fair philanthropic funding system look like? How could this mirror what we want to see in the wider economy? How are we challenging the core tenets of philanthropy as kind of a capitalist system? And what role could funding organizations and grant makers play, in addition to making grants, in pushing us towards new economic models? We're uniquely placed to influence and educate on this. So my message to you all is that when you're doing fundraising, when you're engaging with funders, don't leave your activism at the door. Consider your relationships with funders as key leverage points to create direct impact on new economic thinking, behaviors, policies, processes, not just about securing income so that you can then go and do that work elsewhere. This is the approach that's needed not only to secure more understanding of and investment in the new economy movement, but it's also what's needed to shift the overall economic funding system and the wider economic system too. So that's all for us for now, and thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Emily. Thank you. Yes. Really, lots of food for thought there. Any specifics anybody wants to pick up before we move on? Yes, one at the back there. Oh no, sorry. Oh, sorry. Sorry, microphone, yep. Any specific questions anybody would like to ask? Yes, there's one here in the middle. I think someone's just bringing you a microphone, Chris.
That's better, thank you. Well, it's better for me, I'm not sure it's better for you. Thank you, Emily, Caitlin, it's really interesting. I have a question about your observation, and it's to what extent do you think funders are behaving as a system in order to change a system? Because one of our observations is sometimes systems change can seem like it's something over there and nothing to do with me. And so I'm just interested in your observation about the way funders are operating as a system in order to change the system they want to change.
Thank you, Chris. Let's just see if there are any other questions before we take one. Yeah, I've got two here, so we'll take all those and then we'll answer them and move on. So, yeah, one there and one here. Thanks.
Where you were suggesting that we be an activist with funders, if you could give an example of where that worked and you, an activist organisation managed to change a donor's mind, that would be great. Thanks.
And sorry, could you just say who you are and where you're from? So
Sorry, it's
That's
Kohinoor
okay.
from Share Action.
Thank you very much.
Hello, I'm Mary from Friends of the Earth. It's a similar question actually about being activist with funders, and I wondered if you'd found a difference between different types of funders. I'm thinking particularly about the difference between, say, charitable trusts and foundations and the charitable arms of corporates or trusts and foundations are linked to corporate, because my experience, which I probably don't know if I should be sharing more widely, is that in working with trusts and foundations of the sort represented on this panel are much more receptive to that than, for example, corporate charitable funders, who tend to be more concerned about, yes, but is our logo going to be on this thing, and etc. And I just wondered how that activist angle worked in that context.
Great, thank you very much. So 3 questions there, 2 about so one about changing the system, and the other one about the approach that funders take, and in particular whether corporate funders take a different kind of approach. On you go, thanks.
Such great questions, thank you. I can kick off and then jump in. So I have a kind of reflection that picks up on a couple of the activism points. And at IG, because we work across kind of philanthropy, business, including corporate foundations and not-for-profit sectors, we're working with lots of different stakeholders who are trying to create change in lots of different ways. And when we just kind of narrow that down to working with money, working with resources, so whether doing fundraising or grant making, we get to the point where we're really organizers within a funding system, right? We're trying to organize resource from where it currently sits into a place in the funding system where it can be catalyzed into impact. And so we refer to ourselves and to others who hold those roles as resource activists, because the distinction between funder and fundraiser in that context, we actually find quite unhelpful, because I think, again, many of the folks on the panel might agree that when you are working in a grant-making role, it is still your job to try and organize resource from where it's being held to where it can be catalyzed into impact. You're often having to convince people to spend money, to grow budgets, to give, and to do that in less restrictive, more trust-based, more efficient ways. And that's exactly what you're having to do on the fundraising side of the equation as well. Now, I don't mean to suggest that there's no power dynamic or there's no difference between those two professions, but what we see is the best and it speaks to the problems of corporate, or the challenges of doing so in a corporate environment as well. What we see as the best practices in both of those cases is understanding the role of being an organizer within the funding system. It's not to do the work, it's not to steward the wealth, it's to think, how can we organize resources more effectively within the system to achieve impact, and do so with the various stakeholders that we have to work with. So in a corporate environment, obviously the stakeholders are very different. In many cases, the stakeholders are an active operating business for which profitability is a key success factor in order for philanthropy to happen. Sometimes the same can be said of the way that investments are managed within endowed foundations. And then when you're working with your funders as a fundraiser, you obviously are considering your stakeholders and the power dynamics and their interests and what would turn them off, what would get them to connect with you, etc. So in all those cases, we have to consider our stakeholders, manage the risk of that situation, build the right relationships towards our goals. But taking an activist rather than a capitalist transactional approach to building those relationships is the key thing that we're talking about here, because the more that we try to play the game of capitalism when we are fundraising in philanthropy, the more we are entrenching the behaviors and norms and mindsets that we are trying to then challenge in the rest of our new economy work. And the more we are also compounding and reinforcing some of the risk-averse, capital-centered ways of stewarding resources and investing resources within philanthropic institutions as well. So to go to the question around, what ways are funders operating as a system to challenge systems change? Is that what you said? Yeah. I mean, I think not at all. We talk about the funding system as a whole because it is obviously operating as a system, but in terms of the way that funders operate within that collectively and collaboratively, we most often see, with the exception of some really good practice, funders operating in silos, and there's a significant need for that system to work more collaboratively, more transparently, fewer kind of barriers to kind of data transparency and kind of the territorialism that can sometimes come within philanthropic settings. And so the system itself is something we can all look at and say we want that to work more efficiently, but in terms of how funders within it are thinking of themselves as a force for systemic change, we really don't see that happening enough, and it's obviously something that we work to agitate for change around as well. I'm sure I've forgotten an element of one or more of those questions, but I don't know if you have anything to add.
Anything you wanted to add, Caitlin, before we move on?
And I think some of the conversations which were happening earlier in the day around the importance of investing in relationships, investing in people, in caring about each other and each other's work and really trying to understand each other and bridge divides, I think that's also so applicable to the funding and philanthropy space, and we always really encourage taking a relationship-based approach to the way both funders and fundraisers interact with each other, because relationships are so powerful.
Brilliant. Thank you very much, Caitlin and Emily. So we're going to turn now, Debbie, to you. So many of you will know Debbie Pippard, long-standing senior figure in this sector with Barrow Cadbury. Do you want to just kick off for us?
Thanks, Joanna. And thank you very much for inviting me to speak today. I've got a few slides because I'm super compliant, and when Jake said send slides, I sent slides. Thank you. See if I can work these things. Hey, yes. Too far, but apart from that, there we go, that's me. So Director of Programmes at Barrow Cadbury. Very nice introduction actually from our colleagues here, because you're talking about trying to persuade funders to be part of an activist organisation, be part of an activist sector. We spend quite a lot of our time trying to explain to people that we are activists rather than grant makers. So that's the perspective that we come from, that we've got a budget which we can spend with partners to deliver the change which our trustees and our partners are both trying to create. So I was going to say a little bit about the Trust, a bit about our economic justice programme, and sort of touch on a few current issues in funding, because that was part of the brief, so I'm not going to cover them in detail, but just kind of some of the things that we've been thinking about. Oh, super. So just over 100 years ago, still majority family governed, obviously brings in some issues around governance that we might want to touch on in terms of kind of where foundations are going. We've got an endowment on a good day around 100 million, maybe not quite as good as that at the moment. A number of different programmes funded from our endowment, and a social investment programme, at least one person here is funded through, that is resourced by the Access Foundation. As I mentioned, we consider ourselves to be an activist organisation, and one of the things that our trustees have been very keen on for a while now is using all our assets. So that's not just our grant-making endowment, but the endowment itself, how it's used in the stock markets. We've got a very active ethical investment policy, had one for some time, but also our brand, Cadbury brand, and our personal assets, the individuals with us. The current context, a few things that we're working on at the moment. Clearly, the global economy is in a crisis, interlinked with all the issues that we've been hearing about earlier on. We've got a particular interest in Birmingham, and so the crisis in local authority funding, I think, is relevant to all of those of us who are trying to work locally or nationally. And like many other foundations, we're thinking about some hot topics, including anti-colonial practice, race equity, how the funding community has been complicit in some of those things, and trying to solve some of those on the other hand. I'm going to say a bit about our economic justice programme, which is place-based, another big topic in philanthropy at the moment, and also the debate at the moment about whether foundations should spend out. And we were hearing from Indy, strong advocacy for spending out. Our trustees have decided not to, so that might be something which you want to pick up on later on. So I wish I hadn't been compliant with these slides now. Now we're on food. I'm going to give up on the slides. So our economic justice programme, until fairly recently, was a national programme, but we've changed with the current strategy to just working in Birmingham, with aims that with our partners we would work together to try to reduce economic injustice in Birmingham and the Black Country, that those experiencing economic injustice in that area have the opportunity to influence local and regional and national policy, and that we would share those findings more widely. So we got together a bunch of local partners, most of whom we've been working with over some time. So if I can just get a picture of them. And said to them, we've got some money and we want to change economic systems in Birmingham. What would you like to do with it? Our partners here. And they have come up with an interlinked set of initiatives. So at the centre, we've got an action network pulling together everybody in Birmingham from whatever sector, people living with economic injustice, people working in the Combined Authority, in charities and so on, into an action network where it's a combination of action and learning. So we've put on a number of events to talk about different issues of relevance to changing economic systems. NEON are going to be doing some community organising work. We're supporting several organisations, including People's Economy and the Equality Trust, to support people at the grassroots to influence policy in Birmingham. We're working with another partner on the intersection between economic justice and racial justice, and we'll be supporting a cohort of organisations led by and for racialised people to think about their work in the context of economic injustice. Then we're going to be doing some small grants, potentially thinking about some participatory grant making on that, so to enable people who are experiencing economic injustice to make decisions about where money goes from and choose initiatives that they think are working. And then we've got spaces for other things to come into this picture locally. We've got a steering group and a learning partner who are supporting it. And so what we're essentially trying to do is to build a movement in Birmingham of people who are trying to influence systems change. And that's where we are at the moment in our programme.
Thank you very much indeed. Really fascinating, Debbie. And as someone who's just taken on running a not a dissimilar organisation, it's good to hear all about it. Do people have specific questions they would like to ask? Debbie, yes, I can see one in the middle there. Do we have the microphone, Jake, please? Thank you very much. And if you could also stick your hand up if you have any more questions, but we'll take this one first.
And thank you so much for that. What I'm really interested in is how you are getting organisations to collaborate. And the reason I'm saying that is because often, I mean, I've been probably funded by everybody in this room at some point. I've been a funder. I'm also on the programme advisory group for Friends Provident. And what always happens, and this is a challenge for everybody in the room as well, I'm afraid, is lots of things appear which are variants of another one. And it's as though everything's operating in a vacuum. And either people know that others are doing something similar, and they just don't want to say because they want to look like they're new and get that funding. But there are limited resources, and collaboration across people who are working on something together surely is going to be able to create greater impact. So I'm guessing this approach, presumably, it's not easy to collaborate because, hey, ego has to go out the window, which is hard for a lot of organisations, etc. I'm going to say as it is because of a long time in this. How have you gone through that? How have you created something which is more cohesive?
Thanks so much. Could you just say who you are, please?
Yeah, Andrea at Westall. So I'm
thanks,
struggling to
Andrea.
speak, as
Thank you
can
very much.
tell.
And just before Debbie answers that, are there any other questions for Debbie we could take at the same time? Yeah, we've got one over there on the right.
Hi, my name's Will. I've just got a question about something you said. Did you say that you, as a foundation, are advocating for spending down, but your trustees decided not to? Did I mishear that? So maybe just a clarification. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And is there a final question for Debbie? No? So one on collaboration and one on spending down.
Thank you. So collaboration, one of the, sorry, I get excited and shout. One of the things which has been really joyful about this programme is the level of collaboration that we've had. We haven't started from zero, so we've been working in Birmingham for a long time, and we've got some long-standing and some newer partners. I'm advised by my steering group, my advisory group, is made up of those partners. So they're not all currently funded, but a number of them are. So I think we've taken kind of competition out of that initial, the advisory group. But they've also been incredibly engaged and extremely generous with their time. We've put on, alongside, in the earlier months of the advisory group, we put on some sort of learning events because I was really keen that it wasn't just kind of extractive. We weren't just going to get people together and take their ideas. But people have really learned from each other. We are going to have, I think, coming up, we just talked about this yesterday actually, coming into a phase when some of those grants are coming to an end. And so I've been thinking with people, obviously independently because people are conflicted, about how we do this. I think that as a trust, because we work on very specific issues, we don't have very much, there are more people who want funding from us than we can fund, but there aren't that many more people who fit our criteria than we can fund. So the reason why people tend to get turned down isn't because our trustees had 10 applications and they chose one, which is really difficult. But very early on we were saying, you don't really fit, we're not the funder for you. And then we take through things. So we're able to kind of cut out some of the competition early on. I could talk about this for a long time, but that's probably enough for the moment. Sorry if I kind of misled you. No, I was saying that there's an interest in spending down, and Indy this morning was being an advocate for spending down. Our trustees considered that, and they've decided that the money, that we are going to live for longer than 10 years, and that the money will still be needed kind of after that time, as we're going through a difficult and post-transition. But just saying that it might be something which we want to raise, because it is a hot topic at the moment.
Great, thank you very much, and great questions, Andrea and Will. Thank you very much indeed. Right, we're going to move now and turn to Alec Jacob from Joffrey Trust. Now, I know that Alec is a fascinating speaker because he came along to our Friends Provident Away Day earlier in the year, and it's such an amazing area that you work in, so people will be really keen to hear about that, I'm sure. Thanks.
Well, thank you very much. I thought I had something sort of slightly new and edgy to say, but I realised, listening to the two excellent speakers before, that we're just old school. And frankly, that's not surprising, because when it comes to GCSEs for me, I've got O-levels, so... So I'm Alex from the Joffrey Trust. We're a small specialist grant maker. We were set up by a wonderful man called Joel Joffrey, who was Nelson Mandela's lawyer. And for a long time, we had £10 million in the bank, and we had, through the magic of capitalism that we want to change, we used to spend £1 million a year, and we would end the year still with the same 10 million that we started the year in. So we thought, this is very nice, and we could carry on doing whatever we were doing. But after a while, we thought, look, what's the money for? And Joel died in 2017, and as was long planned, then I took on the executive running of the trust, though I'd been involved for a bit before then. Joel was a modest man, a wonderful and inspiring and ambitious man, but he was always very clear he wasn't interested in his own sort of ongoing glorification. He didn't need his name remembered for his own sake. And looking around the world, as we've talked about today, there's an urgency of now. So a few years ago, we decided to spend our 10 million, and we're now down to 7.5 million, and we'll be gone by about 2030, still spending at about the rate of $1 million a year, maybe a little bit more. And that feels very comfortable in response to some of the debates about power and privilege in the sector more broadly. It also feels very appropriate because there's so much work to be done now, as I mentioned. An interesting implication of this is that it's driven us to become more focused, or at least we found that interesting. That as the years have gone past, we think, all right, we're going to close the doors in 2030, so what do we want to have contributed to by then? And in fact, just next week, I'm going to do another exercise with my trustees of writing our own obituary and saying, well, look, how would we like to be remembered, and do we feel we're on track to achieve something along those lines? With Joel, when he was alive, Joel used to talk to lots of people, and he'd broadly say, after a little bit, look, we've got 10 million quid in the bank, we'd like to make the world a better place, what should we do? And it was astonishing how hard that question was to answer. And lots of people had lots of broad suggestions, but then specifically, if you started sort of to unpack it and say, okay, well, what should we do over the next couple of years, and where do we start? It turned out to be a very hard question to answer. And we came at it from a kind of international aid perspective. Joel was the chairman of Oxfam previously, and that's where I first bumped into him. And so we started with international aid, going, oh my God, we've only got 10 million pounds, such a lot of money, but it's just the tiniest drop in the ocean when it comes to supporting the sort of change that we've been discussing. And then we got into funding work on tax justice, one way or another, and we came to understand a little bit more about illicit finance and how tax dodging is a part of that. And we came to understand a little bit more about how Britain really is a world beater, as they say, is a world-leading centre for dirty money all around the world. And it's an absolute disaster. Huge, the official estimates are that hundreds of billions, with an S, hundreds of billions of pounds of dirty money every year flow through the city, a couple of miles from where we are now, fueling and enabling immense harm all around the world, and also here at home. It's one of the engines of inequality that we've been talking about, is Britain's offshore system. So we thought, oh, well, that's quite a serious situation. Maybe there's something we could do to help with this. And we thought also that that's a British problem, and we're a British charity, and we're British citizens and voters and parents and so on. So this feels much more appropriate than aid, that there's a different kind of legitimacy here. So we've come to focus right in and saying, can we help tackle Britain's dirty money problem? And that's what we do now. That's almost the only thing we do now. And we support a fantastic coalition of organisations who work on this issue. And we've got involved in convening and so on. And actually, it's really striking, Debbie, looking at your diagram there with the Central Action Network and steering groups and so on. Actually, I think it's very analogous, sort of the path we've come down. And we didn't have any grand theory particularly to start with. We just kind of got involved. So, well, I remember one time somebody from one of the organisations we fund said, look, we're doing a strategic review. What do you think we should be doing in this area in the next few years? And I said, God, well, I've got no idea, but why don't we get together some people who do, and we can have a joined-up conversation about it. And so we've done that. We've convened a retreat for the last 5 years to try to work out shared priorities for the coalition of organisations working on this issue, broadly. And that's gone from strength to strength. And in fact, just 3 weeks ago, it led to a shared agenda, an economic crime manifesto that was published a year and a half ago. And just 3 weeks ago, an Economic Crime Act was passed that included loads of stuff from that manifesto. And this is wonderful. And it wasn't everything. It hasn't solved the problem, but it's a huge step forward. And certainly the coalition working together has been able to achieve a great deal more in collaboration than they would have been able to separately. And then we've started now thinking, so that was a tremendous win, really. It's not the end of the story by any means. We haven't fixed Britain's dirty money problem together yet. And so we're now also thinking, well, what's the next set of priorities? And it really speaks to what you were saying about movements depending on a partnership between funders and civil society activists together. And I think we've been able to make some progress that way. And as I said, a great resonance, Debbie, with your work there as well. The work got a huge shot in the arm, you know, in every way, as you can imagine, when OSF decided to get seriously involved about 1.5 to 2 years ago. And they brought substantially more resources than we could bring. But what I was delighted by is that they were a part of the joined-up conversation. They could just step in to the tent, as it were, around the same table where we were all already working, and there was enough shared trust for the coalition to be able to withstand, frankly, that arrival of such a big donor. And I think we did get to a place where, it's very easy for me to say this, of course, where there was a sense of collaboration about what do we want to achieve together, rather than how can each organisation win as big a grant as possible. The challenge is how to continue and build on that. So, for instance, at this, you know, in the conversations we've had ongoing, we've had a very explicit conversation with our civil society friends and partners that this model of short-term grants is okay as far as it goes, but we've kind of got to the limit of what we can achieve with that. We can't plan longer term in terms of staff security and in terms of strategic planning. So we need to move beyond that model. And so that's been on the table explicitly for a little while, for a couple of years. And the response back to that is, well, okay, let's see if we can help. But if you want to get longer term money, we need longer term plans. And it's got to be a we to develop the longer term plans. Plans that we think as civil society, you all think as civil society, as it were, the campaigning and activist organisations are realistic and effective and that you could implement, that come together under some loose overall strategy, and also that will resonate and work well enough for funders. And so we're continuing that conversation now. And one of the things that we're doing at the Joffrey Trust is trying to convene other donors and say, look, a little bit like what you said, what's your issue? If you're interested in any aspect of social or environmental or racial injustice, offshore is a problem. So why don't you help us fix one of these structural problems? Why don't you come in and join the team, be part of the solution to this structural problem? And for some people that resonates and some it doesn't, but that's an ongoing conversation. So it's an exciting time for us. I think we will be able to close the doors in about 7 years' time and sort of look back at Joel and say, yeah, I think we're on course at the moment to do something that he would have been proud of, that would make a difference in the world over the remaining 7 years. But it is a journey, and I'm very much looking forward to continuing it in dialogue with both the funders and also the civil society activists.
Thank you very much, Alex. I told you it would be fascinating, and it was. Questions for Alex? Anybody? I've got one over there. And one in the front. If you could say who you are, that would be great. Thank you, Joe.
Hello, Lisa from FX, funded by several of the organisations on the panel, so thank you. I thought that was really fascinating, and I just had a question around sort of permanency of solution, because in a way, the way that you described what you're doing is that you're there to fix, you know, a problem. But I just wonder to what extent there is permanency in what you're doing, and this is by no means a criticism, just because of the ever-changing political and economic landscape, and how do you account for that in your strategy?
That's a really good question. And there was one over here. Please, Joe. And are there any others while we're on the move, while Joe's on the move? No, doesn't look like it.
Thank you. Jesse Griffiths from Finance Innovation Lab. Love your approach, Alex, as you know. And actually, building on that last question, and it's linked to this should we spend out or not issue. So the reason we have a dirty money problem in the UK is because it suits a lot of people and interests. And those people and interests don't just go away even if we change all the rules in the UK. They will still be there in 2030. And so the question is, for your obituary, what's your vision of the power bases we've built in this country to continue to fight that fight forever, so that we don't just go back, as the previous speaker said?
Such good questions. Essentially, it's about your legacy, or Joel's legacy, or a combination, isn't it? Do you want to have a go at those?
Great, thank you very much. Yeah, great questions. Yeah, I mean, of course, nothing's permanent. It's politics. We're getting involved in politics and social norms, not just politics, but also social norms and professional norms. There's a good history, I think there's a good sort of historical approach that says that Britain's offshore problem is an imperial hangover. That Britain's offshore system really boomed in the 60s at the end of empire, and that wasn't a coincidence. We could get into that more. And so it's possible that there's a sort of distinct period of history when the conditions are appropriate for Britain's offshore system really to boom, and that maybe we could help accelerate its end. I think that's, there's quite a strong argument that way. But nothing is permanent. Nothing's permanent. I think there are some substantial battles that we can help win in the next 7 years. There are some better laws and so on. But there are also, as well as the laws, there are substantial norms. So, for instance, it's an extraordinary norm at the moment. I was talking to a couple of people over lunch about this. The financial secrecy of offshore is totally accepted as normal and okay and proper. And when you step back and look at it, go, how is that okay? The point of offshore is you're hiding money from democratic oversight. To a great extent, that's what offshore is. And we're all slightly gaslit and going, oh yeah, that's fine. Like Nadeem Sahawi, the problem wasn't that he had offshore trust, the problem was that they were misgoverned. You go, no, that is not the problem. The problem is this is a structural disaster. So I think that's a norm that can be changed, and that structural disaster is an engine of inequality, and it's something that we can and should fix. I think it would be harder to recreate it once it's gone, but not impossible. And you're right, there are some very clear opponents in this. But I think one of the interesting things is that there are actually also quite a lot of allies on the right and in the city for this agenda. So our opponents, I think, are a slightly narrower, smaller group than I first realized a few years ago. That there are lots of people in the city who want to do the right thing. And there are systems and structures that have been normalized that are not helping that. Well, we can change that. I think if we do succeed in changing that, that will be harder to shift. So there'll be a real strong political force. And of course, Jesse, I mean, you know much more about political organising and developing power around this than I do. I think the work that the lab does is brilliant in this regard, as others in the room are involved in similar efforts. In terms of continuing the effort beyond 2030, I hope we can contribute in a few ways. I think there is this issue of changing norms. That'll be helpful. Progress we can make whilst, as it were, the trust is still alive. I do think one of the things we can do is help bring other donors in. And I think, and hopefully that will be, and it's wonderful that I think new donors, entirely new donors are developing. And we're talking, there are interesting new green shoots in philanthropy and who have different ways of looking at things, and maybe we can involve some of those. And then I also think one of the things that's quite helpful is, in a way, sort of this conversation and broadening this conversation, the sense that the structural components of the economy are philanthropy's concern. And the more we can amplify that and take that out to other donors, the better. If I may, just one last point, just whilst I've got the microphone. On that, I think one of the challenges for all of us, actually, it's not just a donor challenge or a fundraiser or a fundraiser, civil society challenge, is the problem between breadth and focus. And we've come to this really focused issue. We think it's strategic, and we've kind of just landed here by accident. We think it's important more broadly, but everyone's got their issues. And for a lot of people, offshore is just not relevant, but that's fine. But I think the question we have collectively is, how do we make the broad calls for like system change, which is language personally that I find myself increasingly uncomfortable with because I don't know what it means. How do we get from the, but I totally salute the passion and the commitment and the longer term vision for it, but what do we do tomorrow? How do we marry up the big vision with some really practical strategies for change that are both ambitious and realistic given the actual resources we have? I think that's the biggest question, and if we could somehow come around a collective view of that, then we would be in an incredibly strong position to strengthen the movement, foundationally.
Thank you, Alex. I think that's a really powerful thought. And we're going to add to this rich tapestry that we've been weaving here this afternoon by bringing in Sophie from Joseph Ramsey Charitable Trust. Over to you, Sophie. You don't need to turn it on, it'll just work, apparently.
All good?
Yeah.
Thanks very much. Hi, how's it going? Thanks very much, Danielle, for inviting me, and Friends of Providence staff for setting everything up. It's a really beautiful building. I was last here for the Interdependence Festival for 30 Percy, like I think nearly 4 years ago, and it was also raining, but I was also very happy to be there. So I followed the instructions, which were kindly shared by Jake. So I'm just going to try and focus on what's most helpful, given that most people probably know who JRCT are. Independently endowed foundation, came from Roundtree Money. The program I manage is called Sustainable Futures. So we do some climate and economic stuff, and we also specifically fund to try and expand who's involved in doing that work. We've got a program strand called New Voices, which is essentially about trying to fund and support and recognise the ideas of those who aren't traditionally present in economic and environmental circles. So most people know who JRCT are. I'm trying to think of the most useful things. So JRCT are trying to make reparations. And I have another point I want to make about political education and trade unionism. So I'll focus on that. We have an endowment of about 300 million. Again, it's invested very ethically, and we spend some of the growth, but not all. So unless we choose to spend out, we will exist in perpetuity, which many foundations do. We spent last year 22 million and made 101 grants. On the program I run, we spend 2.3 million a year. Our closest peer funders, quite interestingly, are Friends Provident. So of our 42 grantees, 10 of them are also funded by Friends Provident. Another 5 are funded by Gower Street. Another 5 are funded by Lankelly Chase. So obviously, Gower Street and Lankelly Chase will be closing, and Friends Provident have reduced their grant spend in the past 18 months. So we find ourselves in the position of trying to continue to resource this sector to keep it going, because we are a long-term funder, but also find the money to fund new work and increase the grants that we give. So the average grant that we give is £163,000, and that's doubled since 2019. So we've tried to increase the amount of core funding we give, and we've also tried to fund beyond 3 years. So about a quarter of our grants are 5-year grants, because we know that the conditions in the sector are really, really tough. People are underpaid. It tends to make them stressed, ill, have to leave their jobs, unhappy, generally exploited. So one of the first points I wanted to make was, and I'm glad you mentioned this at the start, the conditions in the sector have to be changed by funders. We can't expect small charities or campaigners to come to us and ask for more. It's within our gift to do that. So we did a recent review, which you can find on our website. It's called the Sustainable Future Review. It's easy enough to find. And one of the things that told us was that when people are writing fundraising bids, they won't account for having to spend time with one another. They won't account for sick pay. They won't account for building up reserves. They won't account for training and development or collaborating with colleagues. And those things are all done somewhere, and there is a cost to them, but we don't pay for it, like somebody else pays for it. So I think we do have to change what we deem to be fundable. So we've started to do this, and one of the consultants produced a tool for us, which is an equitable budgeting tool, which actually gives the true cost of somebody doing the job that we ask them to do. And the difference that made, so one example was a £30,000 application turned into a £60,000 application, but it was properly costed. So that's the kind of hidden cost. And it's really troubling that we haven't properly looked at this as a sector. And connected to that, so in terms of improving conditions in the sector, we have to change it, but we should also be encouraging trade union recognition for our grantees. Trade union membership in the UK, I think, is 22%, was 22% last year, much lower in the third sector. Joseph Rowntree Foundation just recognised a union. We have a recognised union at JRCT, but it's quite precarious and temporary, to touch on an earlier point, to encourage funders to change what they will fund if the power hasn't been built up within the organisations to advocate for that. And that's connected to some of the stuff we fund in economics as well. If you look at what's going on in British Steel and Tata Steel at the minute, with plants being closed and layoffs happening, if there was adequate political education for workers and within communities, we wouldn't have to appeal to the bosses in government to do the right thing all the time. Possibly the most interesting thing, I have to say, JRCT are trying to make reparations. We've been trying to do this for the past couple of years. So the Rowntree money obviously came from the profits from the chocolate trade. We produced a statement, which is still on our website, in April 2022, which said that some of the labour involved in supply chains for the chocolate, so the cocoa and the sugar, was from indentured labour, was from the proceeds of slavery. So we issued an apology, but we also understood that we had to make it right, particularly as a Quaker trust. Like morally, we have an obligation to make it right. So we've been working with a group of experts who've been collaborating with some of our trustees and some of our staff about what we should do, and we're grappling with this question of spend out as well. And in the notes from some of the trustees, I was just reading them on the way down, they're trying to work out, some people are telling us to give it all away because it's tainted wealth, like it was produced unjustly and the growth is unjust and we shouldn't have it. And some people are telling us that that will be us washing our hands of the responsibility to truly be reparative, to make this right, to work differently, and to continue to fund progressive work in the UK. And it's a really, really difficult thing to do. And I think when we set out in this journey, we hoped that there would be an easy way to do it and someone would give us a percentage or a sum and we could do it. But it's proven really difficult for our board. We are doing it. It's just taking a very long time. We're going to be appointing a head of racial justice to oversee the work because the money that we have to move will not be exclusively in the UK. It's going to have to be in parts of Africa and South America. And what else did I want to say about reparations? Yeah, we know that because Lankelly are exiting, Gower Street are exiting, Friends Provident have changed their spend, Joffrey are going. We kind of feel the burden of continuing to stick around. So it's something we're grappling with at the minute. That it might be more straightforward to give all the wealth away and close down, but it's not necessarily the right thing to do, given the problems we're trying to address. So yeah, those are the main points I want to make. Thanks very much.
Thank you very much. Another fascinating area to delve into. Who has a question or a thought or a comment they'd like? There's one at the back, one over here. Yeah, I can see three, Joe. I don't know if you can see them too. Would you like to say who you are? Thanks.
Yes, thank you. Hi, my name's Carrie. I'm from the New Economy Organisers Network. I guess, yeah, thank you very much for what you've said. I think that's really interesting. And I guess like a kind of two-part question, if I may be so cheeky. I think one is, I guess, like, what is the thought around alternatives to being trust and foundations funded for movements, and is that something that you're thinking about in terms of like, yeah, this context of funders spending down and that long-term piece, like if movement organizations weren't to be funded by trust and foundations, what would that look like, and is that something to invest in? And I guess sitting alongside that is a kind of question around when most of the trust and foundations are charities and answerable to the Charity Commission, which is wild place, there's, you know, it kind of inherently stifles like being more radical, which I think some of that like alternative to funding sits in. So like, how does that all kind of work together, I guess is my question.
Thank you very much. I think there were two other questions, yeah.
Oh, the question has disappeared, sorry. I've lost the chat on the... yeah, come back.
It's an online question. We'll come back to that one when Jake's found it. There's one here, yeah.
I'm not sure how I'm going to phrase this, so bear with me. I know obviously with the cost of living crisis, we understand that at a grassroots level, many of the beneficiaries of the organisations that we serve are struggling a lot. But I wondered whether there was anything sort of sector-wide from a funding point of view that looked at the stress that entrepreneurs and leaders of not-for-profits experience whilst trying to navigate this very difficult financial situation at the moment. Having a conversation at lunch today with someone who said that someone who's been an amazing advocate in the sector has found it too financially difficult to carry on with what they're doing. And I just wondered, it's quite emotional because, you know, it's difficult for a lot of our organisations how much that is taken into account.
Thank you very much. And Jake's found the online question now, I think. Thank you, Jake.
Thank you. This is from Sarah Jane Clifton from Economic Change Unit. She's asked, how can we ensure funder spend down decisions are informed by a robust assessment of what it will take to deliver large-scale economic transformation and not driven by guilt and discomfort?
Great, good question. Okay, do you want to have a go at any of those? Sophie, there's a lot there. And we might open it up to others if you see how you get.
Yeah, I'll do, sorry, I'll say a brief thing about both of them. That's a great point about spending down, and we were trying to do that, so that's why we did the analysis of our role in the sector, who else is funding alongside us and how they're changing, and what it would mean for us to exit, like what it would look like for a lot of our grantees. So yeah, I agree with that completely, and I know that sometimes funders, I think we get caught up in the fact that we have a lot of knowledge within our organisations, and we don't think too deeply sometimes about where we get our knowledge from. So we spend ages trying to make the best possible decision, but we're making it with a very small group of people. So yeah, I agree with that. Stress for leaders in the third sector. Yeah, leaders and workers completely. We keep hearing stories of people who can't afford to live in the same city where the organisation's based, people living on houseboats, like house sharing for extended periods of time. And that's why I'm advocating for a combined approach, so funders insisting on decent salaries and benefits for organisations, but also advocating for trade union recognition within those organisations as well. Because there's no piece of sector-wide research that I've seen about leaders in particular. I know some of the charity leaders in this sector have a kind of peer support network, and we've looked into, we funded a couple of those in the past through the Sustainable Future Programme. But yeah, for the conditions to actually change, funders have to, when they get a budget in, they have to look at the salaries and insist that they're higher. And we do that. We do that quite often. I think people have gotten used to trying to represent themselves as being good value, which is really warped, isn't it? So yeah, we see that completely, and it is brutal. It's really brutal. The Charity Commission question. Yes, very interesting one. Our Grassroots Movements Fund at JRCT, which is just through its first pilot round, is working out how to navigate that. However, even on Sustainable Future, and we are a charitable funder, less than half of the people we fund are registered charities. But what we have to do is ask those people to talk about their work in charitable ways. So the influence of the Charity Commission is obviously quite far-reaching. I suppose what we've had to do is where the Charity Commission kind of threatens or encroaches upon the work that some of the organisations that we fund do, is be brave enough to stand up for them. So talking about using all of our assets, including our reputation and our power, and the fact that we can pay lawyers quite easily, whereas some small organisations just can't do that. But it's something we think about all the time, and it's really quite difficult to fund radical work as a charitable trust. I think we've still been able to do it. Like some of the work that we fund, we fund Green New Deal Rising, Coal Action Network, Tipping Point. We fund a lot of great stuff in Northern Ireland. If the board are brave enough and the staff are well informed enough, and we know what we're doing it for, it is possible. But it's always a fear. It's something we're always thinking about as a Charity Commission. I'll let others pick up if they like.
Okay. I think we might come back to that other question, but I'm going to hand over now to Danielle. I should have said at the beginning that I'm Joanna Elson, and I'm Vice Chair of the Friends Provident Foundation, coming to the end of my 3 terms of 3 years, and I'll be very sorry to say goodbye, because it's a fantastic organisation, as you all know. And I've been really fortunate during that time that Danielle has been the chief executive, and I think she's a great leader in the sector. And so she gets the last word. We will have a little discussion afterwards, but the last word for now.
Thank you, Joanna. And Joanna has been, as you can tell, an absolute stalwart and supporter of everything we've done, and also just a really good, what would I say, critical friend occasionally. It's quite good having a chief exec on your board when you're a chief exec, because they know where all the tricks are. And they're going to go, oh, I think that sounds like nonsense. So it's very good. It's really handy, it's really great. And also just to say, I wanted to say just something very briefly on the Charity Commission and JRCT. JRCT has absolutely been, probably of all of us, the one that have gone there with the Charity Commission and supported what they believe in and really backed their own, their assessment and the organizations they support. And so the point about activism and taking a line and holding to it and being one with the sector is absolutely applied to JRCT over the years. I won't talk a load about Friends Provident Foundation because you're all here and you've all read our blooming, strategy and everything else. And we talk about it quite often at our conferences. But I thought I'd just give you a little bit of insight in terms of kind of the overview of the strategy, but also the people. So Friends Provident Foundation, probably other than Joffy, we're quite tiny. So we've got sort of 8 members of staff. At the moment, we have 8 trustees. I was counting them up and I was thinking, I feel it's a bit like you're loads of children. You think, ooh, have I missed one? I'm pretty sure we've got 8 trustees at the moment. Yeah, is that right? When you go, we'll have 7. Is that right? Ooh. Oh, anyway, I'll count them up again. It's a bit worrying now, getting scared. And we also have an associate trustee, Sim, who's here. And I'm happy to talk about we're trying to think about our governance and how we can build in resilience and bring in different kinds of experience of the world, of the economy, and really kind of enrich our governance. So we're quite small. You've seen most of the staff team. Friends Provident came from the demutualization of Friends Provident Life Office in 2002 to 2004. So that was a democratic process where people who owned the company, it was a mutual, decided to privatize it. So we know absolutely the source of our money. You could say it was a financial crime, but it wasn't slavery. It was a democratic process, which I think has informed very much some of the things we've been interested in doing. Our original trustees, quite a few of them were Quakers, so we do come from that Quaker stable. It's the Quaker. I was saying we're a bit like a boy band sitting up here, and it's like this is the Quaker side, a bit of a Quaker vibe going on this side. Essentially, we come from unclaimed assets. We were given £20 million from the company when it demutualized, and they told us to go away and do good and make them look good. And then they promptly went out of business. So we're the last bit of Friends Provident that's left. The rest got kind of absorbed by various other bits of the city, and I think most of it, the book is sitting in Aviva now. Our program, we have one program. We're a bit like Joffy in that regard. We are pretty single-minded. And at one point when we started, our program was about financial inclusion. We actually convened a road of people. We asked them what we should, if you had £20 million, what would you focus on? We got lots of answers. But trustees chose financial inclusion. And it was really about connecting low-income people up to financial systems, because that, in 2004, that looked like the problem. People are just not connected up. They don't have money, advice, banking, affordable credit. We're just going to need to help with that, right? And we chugged along doing that, and we were actually, weirdly, though we're very small, one of the larger funders of financial inclusion work in the UK. And then 2008 happened, and trustees sort of went, oh, hang on, maybe this economic system we're trying to hook people up to Maybe this financial system isn't actually fit for purpose. Maybe it isn't great at allocating risk or reward. Maybe we need to be thinking a bit more deeply about the nature of the economy in terms of how risk-reward resources are allocated in our economy. Maybe we need to think, maybe there's a question about how the economy can serve society better. Is this a design question? That's where we started. And we talked about economic resilience. And that was 2008. Well, we basically got the program up and running after a lot of faffing around, which is what you do in foundations sometimes. And you're trying to work out what to do. You kind of faff for a bit, and you talk to everybody, and you talk again, and you write a couple papers, and then eventually in 2012, we came up with a program, and we got it started on it. And we were actually working alongside you guys, I think, Vera Cadbury, and then you guys started. And so we all started thinking, this is really not actually working. So yeah, that was the beginning of our program. It's morphed a bit. We moved away from resilience to be thinking a little bit more about, actually, we just need to fix the thing. Resilience isn't the issue. We don't want a system that's so resilient, it doesn't change. We want it to change. So we moved away from that a bit. So at the moment, we frame it in terms of the 4 Ds that we think are characteristics of a fair economy. They are not sufficient conditions, but they are a start. And I'm not going to ask everyone to name them. I feel like it could be really very silly, but you know the 4 Ds, so see if I know them. Democratized, decentralized, decarbonized, yay, diversified, or decolonized, depending on how you think about it, because I think, yeah, they're both powerful words and they both mean slightly different things. We think diversifying does more work because it has economic indications as well as issues about who participates, both the what and the who, but yeah, decolonize. So good. That's the grant making side, and the grant making side has 3 streams. Oh no, Joe and Abby are going to get me now. 3 streams, particularly one which kind of is analogous to some of the work JRCT is doing on movement building. One which is looking at financial systems, and that one's one that's not necessarily open for applications. It links to our investment side, which I'll talk about. And the other one is a fair transition. And within that, we've also got small grants going on. So it's quite a lot going on. And because there's a lot going on, and as Sophie said, we've actually reduced some of our grant making, which I'll talk a bit about. We are actually in the midst of doing a bit of a strategy review. And Abby and Joe are really leading on that, which is really trying not to do quite so much over such a big canvas with less money, because we totally were getting into a scarcity mindset. We were just talking about that. Just like we can't do it all. We don't have enough money. When you've got over £1 million, to say you do not have enough money is obscene. So we are actually trying to address that through trying to work out what we can do well. What I wanted to talk about is that actually foundations are very funny beasts, right? So we are social sector organizations. We are absolutely part of a movement. We are also private investment vehicles. So organizations, we talk about our endowments and we say, yeah, we have 100 million or 300 million or a lot more or less. That's all sitting in capital markets doing stuff like now. And we, and a lot of organizations here, I think all of them probably, well, you're all our mates, because we're actually really concerned about what that money is doing. We do try to use all of our assets. We absolutely try to find out what the heck it's doing and try to shape that to serve our missions. Because, that's a lot of money to be working. I mean, mind you, it does seem to diminish. We had the magic money tree for a while as well. We had 30 million pounds, went up to 32 million pounds, and we originally given 20 million by Friends Provident. It was 32, now it's around 24, because we've been spending capital. But there is a thing going on there about how we can make that money work for our missions, because we do have big missions and we're small organizations. And so we've been actually trustees have taken the view that rather than just run down our endowment through grants, we could actually make that money work very, very hard and actually get it to change capital markets. Now, that's hugely ambitious as well. But I think actually we're starting, we have had a little bit of, tiny bit of success in doing that, even with the small amount of money. And we work with Share Action. We really do want to kind of address some of these issues about how money works. Anyway, we've also, my colleague who's not able to be here today because he has COVID, Charlie, leads on our investment engagement work, and we are currently recruiting for a social investment portfolio manager. Because we like to think of it as just the shape of money. Money's got different shapes. Some of it's grant shaped, some of it's investment shaped, some of it's social investment shape. And we're trying to actually use all the tools simultaneously to bring about the change that we're looking for. I will stop talking about this now. I suppose just to say big issues that we're really concerned with that are in our business plan this year are things like aligning our grant making and our investing. We're trying to do that work. It's really hard, and we keep getting confused about what we're talking about. But we are trying to align Charlie's work with our social investment work, with what Abby and Joe do, and trying to basically leverage what little we've got to make it work, to move the dial. And the other thing is that we, what's else? Oh, stewardship. Yeah, the reason we have actually slowed down our spending is that we would have been going out of business, I think, around the time of Joffy, if we kept spending at the same level. I think that's about right. So we've slowed that down. We are still spending capital. We will still disappear eventually, or we'll certainly get closer to it. But we will be around beyond 2030, probably about, at the moment, about 2032, something like that, before we get to half-life. So that would mean we spent half of our endowment, and we need to rethink. So that's kind of where we're at, really open for any questions or discussion around that. But I think these questions about spending out and resource use and how we share it and how we steward it is really a live issue for us all.
Thank you very much, Danielle. Let's give Danielle a We're actually out of time, sadly. I think what we will do, if you have burning questions, stay and ask them, because I don't imagine people will dash away. I'm going to give the panel 30 seconds each to sum up or give you a piece of advice or leave you with one thought they would like you to take away. Can we start with Emily and Caitlin, please?
So we have 60 seconds between us, is that right? Okay. Okay, well, I mean, this was blank when everyone else started speaking, so I've been very inspired by a number of the things that have been shared. I think that there's a couple of things I'd pull out. Ensuring that the table that the coalition is around is ready for new funders to come. I think that point around OSF really rung a bell with me, because that's kind of what we're talking about when we're talking about the need to crowd in new funding into the sector. The table needs to be ready to welcome new people in. It can't be a kind of disparate, competitive field. And also to the question around forms of activism, examples of activism, I think that, you know, a spend down policy is the more radical example that's been discussed here, but that fundamentally is an example of new economy thinking in philanthropy, right? You're doing the opposite of what capitalism tells you to do. And so whilst I understand the challenges of that more broadly about the perpetuity question, I think that that is an example, one of many examples of how new economy thinking can be brought into the philanthropic sector. And I'd encourage you all to think about what you'd like your funders to be doing in that regard.
Thank you. Caitlin, anything you want to add to that?
Yeah, and I think the point that was raised in the discussion at some point around looking after ourselves and each other is just a really, really important one. And as we're all grappling with these challenges, making sure that we're also looking out for each other, because that's also going to make the work sustainable. It's not just about the sustainability of the resource, but also about the sustainability of our brains and our minds.
Good one. Thanks, Caitlin. Alex.
Great, thank you. Well, I think I really want to say good luck to everybody. In terms of one of the strands, I think, has been around changing the funding conversation and try to move away from short-term grants to a slightly bigger funding conversation. I think that's a really difficult thing to do. I think it's a terrific thing to do. I guess in terms of advice, I would think along, think together. It's got to be done in coalition with funders around the table. Think together, think big, what would you do if you had an extra £1 million a year? Really hard question to answer. Specifically, what would you do if you had an extra £1 million a year? I find a very powerful question. So think together, think big, and think specific. We can't fix the whole system. It's never going to be fixed. Okay, fine. I mean, I accept that. Maybe you don't. That's okay. But specifically, what do you want to change? And the key question that I use as a criteria for assessing applications is who do you want to do what? And I found that an incredibly hard question to answer. It's very hard to answer in general terms, but specifically, over 5 years, who do you want to do what in order to deliver change? So that would be my take, my summary.
Brilliant. Thanks, Alex. Debbie?
Yes, so the things that have resonated with me today have been about how we foster collaboration, not competition. So I wanted to thank Friends Provident for bringing everybody together, because I think this is a great way of fostering collaboration, so please do more of it.
Thank you. Danielle?
I think what I would say is that holding the dissonance is kind of where I've been at. So hearing the fact that, for us as funders, we're, as I was saying, deeply undemocratic organizations that are trying to reach and foster democracy. We are wealth concentrators that are trying to disperse wealth. And I think we all have dissonances. We're non-vegans, mostly in this room, yet we are trying to address climate change. So put yourself in the analysis, feel the dissonance, and make it push you for better, basically.
Brilliant. Thanks, Danielle. And Sophie?
One request, I suppose, tell funders the truth about the conditions in your organisations and ask for what you need. And tell us what you think about us choosing to spend down, like what we should be doing with our money. Like, tell us what you think. We will listen to you. Thanks very
Brilliant.
much.
Thank you. Can I say a huge thank you to the panel? I think we've learned a lot this afternoon. Thank you to all of you. If you have other questions you haven't had a chance to ask them, do stay and ask. I'm going to leave you with one thought, and it picks up Caitlin's point about looking after each other. I'm conscious that some of the questions were actually about how we look after ourselves. So I've been reading a book of poetry by someone called Lem Sissay. I don't know if you've come across him. He's just published a new anthology, which is poems that he's written every morning at dawn. That's what he does. And they're 4-line poems. And the one I like goes, "How do you do it, said night? How do you wake up and shine? I take it easy, said light, one day at a time." Thank you all very much.